Okay, so you're here, but they don't have a name tag for you?
Good morning. This Budget Committee hearing will come to order. Welcome to all of our committee hearings, committee members. The tradition in this committee is that the body that last chaired it hands the gavel over. Apparently that's what this is to the new chair. So I am very proud to open this up, and following the tradition of this conference committee, it's my pleasure to hand this ginormous gadget over to my co-chair.
Looks like a keeper.
There you go.
Thank you. I'll put this somewhere else. Thank you very much, Chairman Murray. Welcome, everybody. I see all the House members are here, and, well, today we are considering the concurrent resolution on the budget, S-Con Res 8, and the House amendment. We will begin with opening statements, and I will recognize first myself, then Senator Murray. Conferees will be recognized alternating between the House and the Senate. The conferees of each House will be recognized in the order of seniority, alternating between the minority and the majority. Since there are more conferees from the Senate than the House, after the last House conferee has made their statement, the remaining senators will be recognized alternating between Republicans and Democrats. Due to the large number of conferees, each statement will be limited to 5 minutes. There is no early bird rule. An absent member will be recognized in the next available slot from their chamber. And that's how we intend to proceed for the day. Before I recognize Chairman Murray, I want to share a few thoughts with my opening. And I want to hold myself to the 5-minute rule wherever the clock is. You'll notice that there are 3 senators for every congressman. So as we see it, that's an even match. I like to think that quality beats quantity, but all in jest. In all seriousness, we've got our work cut out for us. It's not going to be easy. So today I'd like to talk about why we're here and what we need to do. We're here because we want to get an agreement. We have a budget conference. We want regular order. We want to make things work. We want government to work. We want to get something done. For too long, both parties have ignored our growing national debt and the threat it poses to our country. Democrats didn't create all these problems, neither did Republicans. Everybody was part of the problem. So everybody has to be part of the solution. But you've got to make an accurate diagnosis before you can fill out a prescription. We've got to recognize what we're dealing with. And I don't know if the AV is ready yet. It's not, I take it. We have an AV problem, so I'm going to just verbalize this. The debt held by the public has doubled in just the last 5 years. It's only getting worse. 10,000 baby boomers are retiring every day. Healthcare costs are rising. Medicare and Social Security, 2 incredibly important programs, they're going broke. The Congressional Budget Office says that if we don't act, we will have a debt crisis. And if that happens, the most vulnerable will be suffering the first and the worst. This debt, it weighs down our economy right now, today. It is a drag on economic growth and job creation today. But right now, we're not doing much about it. We can't keep kicking the can down the road anymore. We've got to get a handle on our debt, and we've got to get a handle on it now. And from my perspective, simply taking more from the hardworking families of America just isn't the answer. I know my Republican colleagues feel the same. So I want to say this from the get-go. If we look at this conference as an argument about taxes, we're not going to get anywhere. The way to raise revenue, from our perspective, is to grow the economy, is get people back to work. We need to write a tax code that encourages economic growth, that doesn't stifle it. And luckily, Democrats and Republicans in the House and the Senate, well, guess what? They're working together to do just that. Today, our tax code is full of carve-outs and kickbacks. We need to get rid of them. And when those bipartisan talks, that's just the way to do it. So let's do all we can to encourage that effort. And let's focus our energy on the task at hand, a budget that cuts spending in a smarter way. Our goal isn't to grow the federal budget, it's to grow family budgets. And to do that, we need to get people back to work. We need to grow this economy. Over 90 million Americans, they're on the sidelines. Over a third of the unemployed in this country haven't had a job in over 6 months. Household income is down significantly. We may disagree over why the economy isn't growing as it should, but I hope we can agree that the status quo is just not acceptable. So let's work together to provide some real relief for families. If we get control of our debt, we will help grow the economy. We'll restore confidence in Washington. The bar is pretty low right now. Let's see if we can clear it. And we'll restore confidence in our economy if we do that. Today, the Federal Reserve is keeping interest rates unusually low. If we lock in some structural reforms now, we will help keep interest rates low, which will help our economy. This opportunity is not going to last forever. Once interest rates rise, debt payments will eat up a bigger slice of the federal budget. We already know that the Fed is going to start tapering next year sometime. That means interest rates will rise. In fact, if we keep kicking this can down the road, those payments might grow so large that they bankrupt us. Structural reforms are crucial to economic growth, and we should act now to get a down payment on this problem. Nobody has to abandon their principles here. Instead, what we ought to do is find where our principles overlap to find common ground. We all agree that Washington isn't working. We all agree that there's a smarter way to cut spending. And we all agree that our economy can be doing a lot better for the people we represent. We won't solve all of our differences here. We won't solve all of our problems. But we can make a good start. And we should, because we owe it to the country. So let's focus on achievable goals. Let's find common ground. Let's make a down payment on the debt. And let's get this economy growing faster. With that, I want to recognize Chairman Murray for her opening remarks.
Well, thank you very much, Chairman Ryan. I look forward to working with you, and I want to thank all the members of this committee for joining us today to make opening statements and to kick this important conference off. After seeing the partisanship and dysfunction of the last few weeks, I know many people across the country are angry at their elected officials and pretty skeptical that we in Congress can get anything done. But I believe that this bipartisan budget conference offers us the opportunity to rebuild some trust, find a path to compromise, and work together to create jobs and boost our fragile economy. It won't be easy. It will require both sides to step out of their comfort zones and ideological corners. And we won't be able to tackle every one of our nation's challenges in these few short weeks. But I'm hopeful that we can at least show that bipartisanship is possible, that we can work together to solve some problems, and that we can break free from the gridlock and dysfunction that has dominated our nation's capital for far too long. 7 months ago, the House and Senate debated and passed our budgets. The Senate budget was built on 3 principles. First, our highest priority was investing in jobs, economic growth, and prosperity built from the middle out, not from the top down. Secondly, the deficit has already been cut in half, and our budget builds on the $2.5 trillion in deficit reduction we have passed since 2011 to continue tackling this challenge fairly and responsibly. And third, our budget keeps the promises we have made to our seniors and our families and our communities. The budget that passed the House reflects very different values and priorities, and finding a path to a long-term budget deal won't be easy. But I want to spend our time here focused not on our differences, but on how we can work together to find a path to compromise. Because the American people saw the partisanship and intransigence that shut our government down and pushed our economy to the brink of catastrophe. And they are demanding that Democrats and Republicans work together and do everything possible to avoid another crisis. Families across the country find ways to compromise every day. They do it in their homes and in their offices. They know it isn't easy, but it's the only way to make progress and work together when there isn't absolute agreement on the path forward. So I agree with those who say the very least this conference should be able to do, the absolute minimum, is to find a way to come together around replacing sequestration and setting a budget level for at least the short term. This won't be easy. The House and Senate budgets are very different even for just this year. But if both sides are willing to move out of their partisan corners and offer up some compromises, I'm confident it can be done. So let's start with something we do agree on. Democrats and Republicans have said replacing sequestration should be a priority for this budget conference. With sequestration deepening for defense programs in January and the extreme cuts continuing to cost us jobs and slash investment in our children's schools, in cancer research, and in our nation's law enforcement officials, there's clear consensus this is a terrible way to cut spending. So the question is no longer whether sequestration should be replaced, but how. As every member of this conference committee knows, both the House budget and the Senate budget call for changes to the Budget Control Act and replace sequestration, just in different ways. The House budget fully replaces the defense cuts, lifts the BCA cap, and pays for that by cutting more deeply from key domestic investments. The Senate budget replaces all of the automatic cuts and pays for that with an equal mix of responsible spending cuts and revenue raised by closing wasteful tax loopholes that benefit the wealthiest Americans and biggest corporations. So getting a bipartisan deal to replace sequestration is going to require compromise from both sides. There's no way around it. I'm going into this budget conference ready to agree to some tough spending cuts that, unlike the sequester caps that disappear in 2022, would be permanently locked into law. I know there are many Republicans who would be very interested in swapping some of the inefficient and damaging sequester cuts with structural changes to programs that would save many multiples of the cuts they replace over the coming decades. I'm ready to listen to their ideas, and as long as they are fair for seniors and our families, I'm ready to make some tough concessions to get a deal. But compromise runs both ways. While we scour programs to find responsible savings, Republicans are also going to have to work with us to scour the bloated tax code and close some wasteful tax loopholes and special interest subsidies, because it is unfair and unacceptable to ask seniors and families to bear this burden alone. Many Republicans already agree that these loopholes and giveaways distort the market, hurt growth, incentivize outsourcing, and hiding profits overseas are nothing more than wasteful spending through the tax code and ought to be closed. So I'm hopeful that we can work together to get that done and get to a balanced deal. Sequestration is bad policy, and Democrats and Republicans have said it's not sustainable. But it is going to continue to cost us jobs and cut vital services until we get a bipartisan deal to replace it that is fair for seniors and the middle class. I know it won't be easy. Compromise, by definition, requires each side to make some changes they couldn't make on their own. But I think we owe it to the American people to find a way to work together. And I know there are Democrats and Republicans in this room and outside this room who agree. Because if there's one lesson to be learned from the past few weeks, it's this. The only way we can avoid gridlock and crisis, and the only way either side can get what they want, is through compromise and bipartisanship. That's what the American people are expecting and want from this conference, and I am looking forward to getting to work to do that.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman Marie. Before I recognize Mr. Van Hollen, I want to announce our next meeting. It's going to be when our session calendars overlap. We will reconvene on November the 13th at 10 a.m. And with that, Mr. Van Hollen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's good to be on the same side of the table as you and with all our colleagues, and it's great to be here for long overdue budget negotiations. It was just 2 weeks ago today that we ended the shameful government shutdown and the threats to default on our nation's debt. The country has paid a steep price for those reckless actions. Standard & Poor's estimates the shutdown cost our economy $24 billion, and the Peterson Institute has calculated that economic uncertainty caused by constant budget brinksmanship has cost our country 900,000 jobs since the 2010 elections. I hope every member of this committee, Democrats and Republican alike, will put away threats of future shutdowns and default and focus our efforts to help our economy grow. The House and Republican and Senate Democratic budgets before us represent very different visions for the future of the country. We're not going to be able to bridge all those differences, but I hope we can make some progress, and that will require tough compromises. But it's also important to be honest with the public about the nature of our differences, because to govern is to choose, and our budgets reflect different choices. The primary objective of this negotiation should be to immediately accelerate job growth and place our economy on a stable, long-term foundation. The Democratic budget does this by investing in national priorities, replacing the job-killing sequester, and reducing the long-term deficit in a balanced way. It provides for vital investments to ensure that America remains the world's economic powerhouse. We allocate resources to put people to work, modernizing our schools, our bridges, our ports, and other infrastructure that forms the backbone of our economy. These investments used to be a bipartisan priority. Unfortunately, the Republican budget assumes very big cuts in our transportation spending. In fact, it would practically eliminate the start of new highway projects as soon as 2015. Our budget also invests in our nation's most valuable resource, our kids, by boosting support for education, including an early education initiative. The Republican budget in the House resulted in a cut of 20% below sequester levels to that part of the budget that funds education. These choices have real consequences. We also know that the deep, immediate sequester cuts are hurting our economy. The nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office tells us that the MEAT Act's cuts to defense and national priorities will result in 800,000 fewer American jobs by this time next year. We all know there are smarter ways to achieve equal deficit reduction without economic harm. In the House, many of us have offered a plan to replace the sequester with a balanced mix of targeted cuts to wasteful spending and cuts to unproductive special interest tax breaks. Unfortunately, we've been denied an opportunity to vote on that plan. Finally, this committee should continue our work to reduce our long-term deficits and shrink the debt. Over the last few years, we have cut the 10-year deficit by over $2.7 trillion, excluding the sequester. 3/4 of those savings come from budget cuts, 1/4 from revenue. If you factor in the additional $1 trillion in savings resulting from slower than expected health care costs, which are due in part to changes in the Affordable Care Act, the ratio of cuts to revenue is more than 4-to-1. Still, we can and should do more, but there are dramatic differences between our budgets as to how we tackle the challenge. The Democratic budget, as Senator Murray indicated, adopts the balanced approach recommended by every bipartisan group. The Republican budget from the House takes a very different approach. It drops the tax rates for the very highest income earners by a full third, providing a windfall to the very top 1%, and at the same time undercuts other important priorities and commitments. Any agreement will require difficult compromises, and we should not start the negotiation by taking things off the table. Finally, Mr. Chairman, I would just like to mention one other national priority that could both help get the economy moving, help reduce the deficit, and strengthen Social Security, and that would be to pass the comprehensive immigration bill in the House of Representatives. That would accomplish a lot of the goals of this committee, and we simply need a vote to make it happen. So I hope we will look at all the possibilities before us for growing our economy and reducing our long-term deficit. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Next, we'll hear from the ranking member of the Senate Budget Committee, Senator Sessions.
Thank you. In this room are some of the most knowledgeable people in our Congress, really in our nation, and the challenges we face economically and with budget and debt, and I believe that we can make some progress as this committee goes forward. The purpose of a budget is to develop a financial plan for the future of America. It's not easy, and our differences are real, and it's difficult to bridge them, but there are actions which we can take that we can agree on that will improve the financial standing of America and economic growth. And so it's important that we work at it, and I think the regular process of a budget conference committee is a positive development for sure. Our colleague Ron Johnson is a successful businessman. He's correctly told us if you want to develop a strategic plan, and we need to, the first thing you have to do is get in contact with reality and to agree on the problem. For the past 5 years, we have had record deficits. This stimulus vision, this spending agenda that has been the vision that's governed America that projected and predicted vigorous growth, lasting prosperity, has not worked. We've seen it play out. More spending, more taxes, more borrowing, more regulation in all aspects of American lives have not added to the improvement of our economy. We have added $6.9 trillion to the debt. Tax, spend, regulate, and debt, we believe, will never work. It can never be the foundation for lasting prosperity and growth. It's a plan guaranteed to fail. So your take-home pay has fallen for the last 5 years. Median household income is lower today than in 1996. We have the lowest labor force participation rate in 35 years. A smaller percentage of Americans are working today than in 35 years. We have 12 million more residents than in 2007, but 2 million fewer workers. What we should do is create the growth-oriented tax system that makes America more globally competitive. We need to eliminate unnecessary regulations. We need to produce more American energy. We need to ensure that trade is fair and our workers can fairly compete. We need to enforce an immigration policy that serves our national interests. And we need to reject large government programs that we cannot afford, that kill jobs and keep us from balancing the budget. And we need to balance the budget. As Congressman Ryan said, that in itself will be a strengthening factor for an economy that's uneasy today. These are common sense of programs that will work. These ideas are consistent with the American ideals that have served us so well over the centuries. The Budget Control Act reduced the growth rate in federal spending by $2.1 trillion. That is an important first step. After this year, we will see a 2.5% increase in all the programs that were affected by the Budget Control Act. So this is the tough year. This is the year that we will have the toughest time. But after this, growth will occur in our discretionary accounts. Congress and the White House must keep their promises to the American people. If we violate the solemn promise contained in the Budget Control Act and the plain law that it is, how can we expect the American people to believe us when we make new promises about what we're going to do in the future? No honest evaluation of the nation's finances can ignore the impact of the Affordable Care Act. At my request, GAO has concluded the legislation is not paid for as promised and will likely add $6.2 trillion to the deficit over the 75-year window. We need to be shoring up Social Security, not adding another huge unfunded liability. Medicare has a far worse debt course, adding $36.2 trillion in unfunded liabilities to the nation over this same period. Medicaid, the free health program for our low-income Americans, has no trust fund and is on a particularly unsustainable course. Outlays for this program will reach $4.3 trillion over the next 10 years alone. The Budget Control Act made spending progress, but it leaves our budget on a path to grow 69% over the next 10 years. That's largely because while it's imposed controls on certain discretionary programs, many mandatory and welfare expenses are left totally untouched. CBO says this path, they've told us, is unsustainable. We are not on a sustainable path today. It will create trillion-dollar deficits in just 10 years. We will be back to a trillion-dollar annual deficit within 10 years. Yet the Senate budget would void half of the modest cuts and reductions in BCA. It proposes to spend $1 trillion over the Budget Control Act levels and raise taxes by $1 trillion. The truth is we must recognize that the BCA is only the beginning. More will have to be done. We remain with it on an unsustainable course. But I think there's a different spirit today. I think we have the potential to recognize the differences we may have in vision, and somehow we can make some steps that are good for America. Mr. Chairman, thank you, and Chairman Murray, for your leadership.
Thank you. Now that the opening statements for the chairs and the ranking members are over, I intend on enforcing the 5-minute rule. Just just to accommodate everybody's schedule here. So, hey,
Chopped liver.
it is what it is. The Senate, I'm told, has a vote at 10:30. We plan on proceeding, so hopefully some can stay in while others go to backfill. And with that, I want to recognize the Vice Chair of the Budget Committee, Dr. Kreis.
Thank you, Chairman Ryan. Just 2 weeks ago, our nation surpassed $17 trillion in debt, with trillions more on the horizon. We're on a completely unsustainable path that's threatening the security and prosperity of our nation and mortgaging our children's future. We must act with honest purpose and urgency. A lack of will, political or otherwise, to solve our challenges is immoral and irresponsible. Now, at this point, there's not much to be gained by focusing on who's to blame for this fiscal mess. What we should be concerned with is how we're going to clean it up. Each and every one of us sitting at this table has been entrusted with that responsibility and this opportunity, and I think there's a path to an agreement. We're blessed to live in the greatest country ever, a nation that has met every single challenge. And we haven't done so because we viewed those challenges as a zero-sum game where one side wins and the other side loses. We've done so because leaders have worked together and found common ground and solutions that work. Now, our challenges are huge, and they're growing. The federal government is spending well over $3 trillion a year. We've had recent deficits as high as $1.5 trillion and continue with annual deficits of hundreds of billions of dollars, still large enough to be singularly unique in the history of the world. And this in spite of the fact that the federal government took in more revenue last year than ever before. But there's also more to this than numbers on a page. Today, more than 16 million Americans, including 20% of all children, still live in poverty. Nearly 50 million of our fellow Americans live on $23,000 a year or less. These are the highest poverty rates in 2 decades. And to make matters worse, life has become too painful and expensive for almost everyone. Unprecedented labor force dropouts, ever-increasing energy costs, skyrocketing health care costs, all resulting in many of our fellow Americans struggling just to get by. Washington spends more and more and more, and yet our problems get worse and worse and worse. Taking more out of the pockets of hardworking Americans just to satiate Washington won't solve anything. And at this point, a bailout for politicians in the form of more taxes so they can continue to spend well beyond our means is a recipe for more fiscal and economic pain. So the question becomes, how do we begin to make government more effective and efficient and accountable? There's no question that we must protect the vital services that government provides. We want to save and secure critical programs for our seniors like Medicare and Social Security, programs that they paid into and expect to be there, but programs that, according to independent actuaries, will not have the resources needed to survive if they're not strengthened. We want to repair America's safety net so that we may protect the most vulnerable among us in a fair and a caring manner. And we want to strengthen our national defense so that the greatest nation in the world that the world has ever known can remain strong and independent and free. And we want to help grow the economy so that millions upon millions of our fellow Americans who are unemployed or underemployed can get back to work to support their families and realize their dreams. So our opportunity here today and in the weeks to come is to identify the common ground for positive solutions. There may also be an opportunity to achieve consensus and savings on better government policies. Imagine the savings that might be had if we were serious about identifying real waste in government, or fraud that cheats every single American every single day, or abuse of systems that are meant to help, or imagine reforms that concentrated on ending duplicative and redundant programs that do nothing to further their original goals. Imagine those kinds of savings that get away from the we win, you lose mentality here in Washington. A friend asked me the other day, what are you doing differently today that you weren't doing yesterday? And if you're not, why would you expect a different result? So let's do something different. Let's work together and imagine an agreement by this conference committee that would inspire the American people and begin to rebuild the trust so lacking now in all of us that we can actually meet the challenges before us. Let's not lose this opportunity. The status quo here in Washington certainly isn't working, and it's not working for millions of Americans who are struggling just to make ends meet. Every day that we fail to act positively is a day filled with more debt and less security and less opportunity for the American people. I look forward to having all of us put aside our talking points, ignore the routine Washington think of we win and you lose, and coming together to meet this challenge and meet it in a way that respects each other, respects our constituents, and the history of our great nation and the leaders who have come before. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Next, Senator Wyden from Oregon.
Thank you very much, Chairman Ryan. Colleagues, I think that Senator Murray and Congressman Van Hollen are leading Democrats superbly, and I want to make it clear, I think that the constructive tone that we've heard from colleagues on the other side is very helpful as well. This budget conference is an opportunity to transition from crisis to consensus, and we have to keep our eye on the stark reality. The government shutdown has hurt our economy and slowed economic growth. I was struck, Congressman Van Hollen mentioned a couple of the headlines. The one that is particularly painful to me is entitled Consumer Confidence Collapsed This Month. Thanks, Congress. So our first, second, and third priority is to find policies that help grow wages, create good jobs, and help our people. We want to make sure that the middle class can stay on the rungs of the middle class economic ladder, and we want to have policies that help those that aren't there get there. And a key to this is to provide, with our efforts, a new measure of stability and predictability for our economy. So I want to tick off just three very quick points. The first is taxes. The tax code just turned 100, and it looks every day its age. It is a broken, inefficient mess. It's time to clean it up and bring it into the 21st century. I want to make it clear I'm totally committed to comprehensive tax reform, and also there are plenty of rip-offs and loopholes for us to close in the meantime without jeopardizing the goal of comprehensive tax reform. So my hope is that this conference can put our feet in both camps, for tax reform and against tax rip-offs. And some good places to start. Certainly the provisions in the tax code that encourage companies to move investment and jobs overseas is a good place to start with respect to closing some of those wasteful loopholes. And then 1986, as colleagues here have discussed in the past, is a pretty good model for bipartisan tax reform. Second is Medicare. The future for Medicare, in my view, is better care at lower cost. And Medicare in 2013 is very different than Medicare in 1965. Chronic disease, cancer, diabetes, strokes, and heart problems drive Medicare like never before. Current government rules and practices impede our efforts to deliver to these vulnerable seniors better care at lower prices. Senator Isaacson, Congressman Welsh, Congressman Paulson, and I are working on a bipartisan proposal to address these issues. We look forward to working with the conference on those questions. There is a better way, colleagues. There is something between slashing benefits and standing pat. We look forward to working with all of you on that. Third point deals with the fairness question. My view is there has to be parity between defense and non-defense in the overall efforts of this agreement. The rules of the whole sequestration debate, we all know that you walk into a Dairy Queen, nobody knows what sequestration is. But they do know what fairness is. And the rules were that you were going to cut defense and non-defense equally. To change those rules in the middle of this debate, I think would be a very substantial mistake. And it seems to me that what we do with respect to defense, if we're adding money back there, we need to make an equal commitment to health, education, infrastructure, and science investments that will secure our future. Those three areas, taxes, the question of better care at lower costs through Medicare reforms, and budget fairness, strike me as three areas where we can, as colleagues have said, come together and find common ground. Look forward to working with all of you to do that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Thank you. Member of the leadership team on the Democratic side of the House, Mr. Clyburn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The principal task force of this committee is to agree on a budget for the remainder of fiscal year 2014. While it would have been prudent to have these negotiations last summer, I am pleased that we are now beginning these important discussions about our nation's fiscal priorities. We must address the automatic spending cuts that are hurting our economy and undercutting important priorities like education, medical research, and national security. But we must put our nation's fiscal house in order and reduce our long-term debt to a manageable level. There are different ways to do this, and of course some are better than others. On the graph you see on the screens, there are two lines. The red line charts the deficit over the past 65 years. The blue line charts the unemployment rate over the same period. The relationship is obvious. When unemployment goes down, the deficit goes down. When unemployment goes up, the deficit goes up. The reasons for this are clear. When you don't have a job, you don't pay taxes. When you don't have income, you're not paying payroll taxes, and you're more likely to need government assistance. Unemployment is a double whammy for a federal budget. To lower the deficit, we have to lower unemployment. Advocates for extracting deficit reduction from the most vulnerable by cutting benefits under Medicare, Medicaid, the Children's Health Insurance Program, nutrition assistance, and other vital services ignore the fact that when you cut essential benefits, you just shift the cost of these necessities onto senior citizens, parents, and low-income, hard-working people. These cost shifts take money out of the pockets of consumers that would otherwise be spent in other parts of the economy, helping businesses grow and creating jobs. Cutting benefits cuts jobs, and cutting jobs is not the way to reduce the deficit. Securing deficit reduction by cutting key investments in education, Pell Grants, infrastructure, job training, and research and development would hinder economic growth in the short and long term by depriving our nation of the physical and human capital we need to have a strong economy with a 21st century workforce. Cutting investment jobs and cutting jobs is not the way to reduce the deficit. We Democrats have a different approach. We fully recognize the importance of fiscal responsibility, but we know from the chart that any budget cuts that destroy jobs will be counterproductive. We know that cuts that fall disproportionately on our most vulnerable citizens make our economy more vulnerable as well. We know that a reasonable, balanced approach involving shared sacrifice is not only the fairest way to cut the deficit, it is the most effective. We also believe that higher levels of revenue are fully compatible with strong economic growth. We have seen that tax cuts for the wealthy have increased the deficit and do not create jobs. We know that much of our national debt is a result of two wars, and now that we have ended one and are winding down the other, significant savings have been generated, which I believe should be used to eliminate the sequester and target funds to those communities that have been suffering disproportionately for the last 30 years. They would generate economic growth and begin closing the wealth gap that is threatening family security and our nation's stability. I was very pleased to read last week that our colleague, Mr. Cole, with whom I am sitting today, who I consider to be a good friend, said the reality is you're going to have a deal here, and a deal means everybody gives something up. I agree with my friend. I look forward to working constructively towards a deal to grow our economy, protect our vulnerable, and ensure that we must remain on sound fiscal footing.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Going in order, we'll next hear from Senator Nelson from Florida.
Good morning, Mr.
Morning.
Chairman.
Morning.
I think It's our intention to address these serious issues with candor and an open mind and a willingness to listen to the opinions of others. If we are true to that, it will be a refreshing change from the unwillingness, from the shouting past each other that has dominated Washington, has dominated not only our discussions on the floor, but have dominated these talk shows where people are just shouting past each other. You think back to a statement that President Kennedy made. He said he preferred to find not Democratic or Republican answers, but to find the right answers. And I hope we'll take that approach. The only certain hurdle we have to overcome is ourselves. And the thing that could derail a bipartisan agreement is a reversion to the display that we've seen, excessive partisanship and ideological rigidity. So we have a responsibility here to put aside these political differences in favor of finding a bipartisan solution. I'm basically an optimist. I'm optimistic that we're going to find a new bipartisan spirit here, and I'm hopeful that we can talk openly and honestly about how to move this country forward. Now, there are some of the questions that seem to have obvious answers. For example, we need more targeted budget cuts of wasteful government spending coupled with realistic tax reform. Who among us does not believe that we cannot do serious tax reform? We need to close some of those loopholes that allow some of the more privileged and the more profitable corporations a system that allows them to avoid paying taxes. And we need to find ways to prevent things like the so-called offshore tax dodges. The difference between the House and the Senate is about $90 billion. That's just about what published reports say that the Treasury loses each year from offshore tax havens. That's just an example or two that could save more than enough to resolve the differences between us. And so while we go about trying to negotiate this budget plan, I'd also be mindful, I ask that we be mindful of the need to support a strong and hopefully a growing instead of shrinking middle class, and the needs of folks on housing and access to affordable health care. And this senator does not want to do this on the backs of Medicare and Social Security beneficiaries. And so in the meantime, I'd say let's stay focused on the problem, not our differences. Let's judge ideas not as Republican or Democratic, but as a good idea or a bad idea. Thank you.
Congressman Cole from Oklahoma.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, the challenges we face in this conference committee are significant. According to the latest CBO long-term budget outlook, between 2009 and 2012, the federal government recorded the largest budget deficits relative to the size of the economy since 1946. Federal debt held by the public is now about 73% of GDP. That percentage is higher than at any point in U.S. history except for a brief period around the Second World War, and it's twice the percentage at the end of 2007. And our nation's debt will continue to rise with no end in sight if Congress does not act. Mr. Chairman, there's a real opportunity here to show the American people that we can set aside our differences and negotiate long-term reforms. We can succeed where the supercommittee and other bipartisan working groups have failed, but it will not be easy. My friends in the other body have a very different proposal from the House position, one that significantly raises taxes, continues funding the Affordable Care Act, and while stabilizing the debt as a percentage of the GDP, basically accepts the over $17 trillion of debt already on the books. At the same time, I'm sure there are a number of things in our budget proposal that the Senate finds objectionable, like block granting Medicaid, premium support for Medicare, and balancing the budget within 10 years. I'm hopeful that this committee can come to agreement on eliminating the damaging and senseless cuts associated with sequester by replacing them with changes to mandatory spending like those suggested by President Obama. Mr. Chairman, we must break the pattern of living from crisis to crisis and relying solely on short-term funding agreements. It's become a dangerous, commonplace habit since the last time both chambers agreed to a budget in 2009. We need to provide the Appropriations Committee with certainty so they can craft bills that have the possibility of becoming law, and we must find ways to deal with our growing debt. There's much work ahead to improve our economic situation and solve our current fiscal crisis, and I'm hopeful that we can find some common sense reforms that improve our economic outlook and provide a better future for our children and grandchildren. But negotiations and reforms don't end here in this committee. This is the starting point that encourages Congress to acknowledge and address our debt. As the Appropriations Committee has demonstrated, we can cut discretionary spending. In fact, we have cut discretionary spending in each of the last 3 years, a feat not accomplished since the 1940s. But, Mr. Chairman, with all due respect, it's time for the Ways and Means and Finance Committees to do the same. As I'm sure you're aware, mandatory spending programs and net interest on the debt comprise fully 3/4 of all federal expenditures. At the same time, the over 200 tax expenditures amount to more than $12 trillion over a 10-year budget window. I find it quite hard to believe that every one of these expenditures is necessary or could not be limited in some manner. Mr. Chairman, I've been quoted as saying that revenue should be on the table in the course of the conference committee, and I believe that it should, but not in the way that some of my friends from the other side suggest. I think tax rates are already extraordinarily high for hardworking American families. However, there are a number of pro-growth policies that, if enacted, would generate significant revenues for the federal government and grow our economy. Policies like the reparation of corporate profits from overseas, expanded oil and gas exploration offshore and on federal lands, and one-time federal asset sales and the like. More revenue doesn't and shouldn't mean higher taxes. At the same time, I believe this committee should set forth a path to allow for expedited consideration of a tax reform proposal. It's been over 25 years since we've taken a comprehensive look at the tax code, and in that time, the fundamental nature of our economy has changed. It's important that our tax code now reflect the priorities of the 21st century. Americans want solutions that reduce the deficit, overhaul the current tax system, create more jobs, spur economic growth, and preserve the full faith and credit of the United States. The English statesman and political philosopher Edmund Burke once said, quote, "All government, indeed every human benefit and enjoyment, every virtue and every prudent act is founded on compromise and barter." While Republicans maintained the majority in the House in the last election, Democrats maintained their majority in the Senate, and the president was reelected. No party will get everything that it wants, and no side can dictate to the other. Sadly, compromise has become a dirty word in Washington. However, it's even more necessary in divided government. Otherwise, the American people are the ones who lose. Now is the time for us to show the American people that even in divided government, we can find ways to function, achieve common ground, and make all voices heard and considered. I look forward to working with my friends in both chambers and on both sides of the aisle to find common ground where we can avoid a debt path which the CBO calls unsustainable indefinitely. That I yield back.
Thank you. Perfect time. Senator Grassley.
Mr. Chairman, there's a great deal of comedy expressed here, and I hope it's very successful in getting us together. So I'm glad to be here to work with our House colleagues to reconcile differences on the 2014 budget. This is regular order, and in recent years, regular order has become an oddity. Our country is on an unsustainable fiscal course, yet this is the first time since 2009 we've worked together to reconcile. This is just the first step of this conference. I make a simple request regarding process. The people's business ought to be public. We've got important and difficult matters before us. The deliberation shouldn't be done in the dead of night in the back room with only a few individuals. To regain the trust of the American people, we must demonstrate working together to confront our fiscal challenges. There is much cynicism among the populace about what goes on here in Washington. Part of that cynicism, I believe, comes from the fact that many of the recent budget deals have been concocted in the back office of a few leaders, and rank and file members were left to take it or leave it. They weren't debated, there was no deliberation, and nearly no one had an opportunity beforehand to even read them. This is a terrible way to govern. It's part of the reason people don't trust Washington to do what's right. We should use this budget conference to change that perception and hold our meetings in public. The President and the Senate Democratic leadership have insisted upon a balanced approach to replace the sequester cuts. This so-called balanced approach would include tax increases with some pending cuts. The problem with this logic is simple. The fiscal problems facing the federal government are not balanced. The problem is not that we tax too little, it's that we spend too much. The offer of a so-called balanced plan is wrong-headed. The problems we face are caused by a one-sided problem, and that is too much spending. The Congressional Budget Office projects that by 2038, federal spending will be 26% of GDP compared to the 40-year average, 20.5. Spending on health care entitlements and Social Security will double over the next 25 years. As a result, deficits will continue to grow, and the resulting debt will grow faster than GDP, a path which is unsustainable. CBO's projection included revenue levels higher than the historic average. There is the root of the problem. Spending growth outpaces higher revenue. The President talks a great deal about growing our economy, creating jobs, and growing the middle class. I don't believe that we need to grow government in order to create jobs, to grow the economy, or increase the prosperity of Americans. A more prosperous America does not result from an ever larger, more intrusive government. President Kennedy knew the virtues that wealth left in the hands of entrepreneurial Americans would create new jobs, spur economic growth, and grow the economy. President Kennedy stated this in 1962. The tax system, quote, exerts too heavy a drag on growth in peacetime, that it siphons off out of the private economy too large a share of personal and business purchasing power, that it reduces the financial incentives for personal effort, investment, and risk-taking, end of quote. Yet the Senate budget, which I oppose, would increase taxes by $1 trillion. President Obama got his tax increase on the fiscal cliff deal of January 2013. We increased taxes on job-creating Americans by $600 billion. Now is the time to focus on the other side of the ledger, the spending side. I remain cautious about plans to trade spending reductions that are in the law as a result of the Budget Control Act for the promise of spending cuts or entitlement reforms at some future date. I will not entertain a so-called balanced plan that punishes small business and job creators with higher taxes in exchange for minor entitlement reforms that do not change the deficit or the debt trajectory of our country. If we're going to reform our entitlement programs to ensure their viability for future generations, we should do just that. President Obama's budget could be a starting point and should be considered. I'm aware that there is a great deal of angst surrounding the impending sequester cuts, particularly those in defense. But I'm satisfied that defense is not a sacred cow that can't have innumerable savings as well. I'll close by just simply saying that if we could get the Department of Defense to have an accounting and audit practices and an up-to-date audit control system, we'd have a lot less waste there. I'll put the rest of my statement on record.
Thank you. Thank you. The ranking member of the House Appropriations Committee, Congresswoman Lowy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I come to this conference with the perspective of 2 decades on the Appropriations Committee. Our priority must be to continue to grow the economy, create jobs, and strengthen the middle class while reducing the deficit in a balanced and responsible way. The reckless government shutdown and threat of default cost $24 billion in economic activity and 120,000 jobs. Now looming reductions in the House budget and appropriation bills further threaten economic growth. We have a mandate from the American people to ensure that we do not face another shutdown or default showdown, and there is bipartisan support for ending automatic drastic cuts that will cost 800,000 American jobs next year if left in place. The House majority could not pass any spending bills at the sequester levels. When Republicans pulled the transportation HUD bill from House consideration, Chairman Rogers said, quote, "With this action, the House has declined to proceed on the implementation of the very budget it adopted just 3 months ago. The House has made its choice. Sequestration and its unrealistic and ill-conceived discretionary cuts must be brought to an end," end quote. Let's consider some of the sequester's impact on jobs and the economy. $1.55 billion less for the National Institutes of Health to conduct groundbreaking medical research, every dollar of which generates 2.21 in local economic growth and supports high-paying jobs. 57,265 fewer children in Head Start, resulting in 18,000 staff members who have suffered pay cuts or lost their jobs. 650,000 Department of Defense employees furloughed, resulting in $2 billion in lost wages around the country. 2,000 fewer National Science Foundation competitive awards, affecting more than 21,000 researchers, teachers, students, and technicians. $221 million less for the Department of Energy's Office of Science, risking, among other things, the United States' leadership role in advanced computing. The return on investment for publicly funded scientific research and development is somewhere between 30% and 100% or more. At a time when economic success in the global market is determined more than ever by the pace of innovation, we cannot afford to reduce our investments in research. These cuts, which will only get worse, are forcing impossible choices for American families. Should mothers quit their jobs when their children lose access to Head Start? Should promising young students rethink a career in science because of a lack of available research dollars? In addition to furloughs for defense employees and reductions to military readiness, the Department of Defense will lose $20 billion more in mid-January if we don't act to avoid another year of sequester cuts. Everyone in this conference has reason to find common ground. We have already enacted $2.5 trillion in deficit reduction, of which $1.5 trillion has come from discretionary spending, and that doesn't even include across-the-board reductions. Let's work together. Let's work together again to replace the automatic spending cuts that are hurting jobs and our economy with a balanced plan that slashes spending on wasteful special interest subsidies and tax loopholes that allow a select few to avoid paying their fair share. Finally, I hope that we will hold a number of open sessions to discuss proposals in considerable detail so that we really understand how they would affect ordinary people and American prosperity. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Senator Enzi.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Americans are tired of the habitual political promises Congress makes to fix our annual deficits and growing national debt. This conference committee is another one of those promises. This was part of a promise that if members supported more borrowing, Then we'd talk about how to control spending. What did we hear from the president? The same thing. Let's raise spending limits, let's spend more, then we'll talk about it later. I'll tell you from the start, that wasn't good enough for me before, and it's not good enough now. If we work together, we can control spending without it being a make-it-hurt mentality. But if we don't, we're all in for a real hurt. It's time to move forward. Let's do something. Our goal during this conference should be to find common ground on solutions that address our country's annual deficits and perhaps the $17 trillion growing debt. We shouldn't be in the situation we're in. The government should not have shut down. In the Senate, we should have brought up the spending bills on the floor, hopefully one per week, and we would have had the time to fully debate the measures, offer amendments, and improve the bills. No one senator, no one party has a monopoly on good ideas. Instead of identifying those good ideas, we got another deal that raised the debt limit and did nothing to address the underlying spending problem, nor did it give stability to agencies. We've got to start legislating and stop deal-making. I hope we can at least make a small move in that direction with this conference committee. I've got several ideas for how to keep us out of the situation we were just in and make reasonable but real progress on our deficits and debt. I have a penny plan, an idea on biennial budgeting, some relevant amendments for spending bills, end the shutdown bill, and forced prioritization and tax reform. I'd like for us to consider my penny plan, which cuts overall spending by 1% for 2 years and balances the budget so that we don't have to raise the debt ceiling. We've got to stop spending more than we take in and find a way to start paying down the $17 trillion and growing debt. The penny plan doesn't mandate any specific cuts. Congress would have the authority to make targeted cuts and focus on the worst first, but would be required to meet the 1% overall cut. Everything would be on the table, and I would argue that we should focus on identifying and eliminating all the wasteful and duplicative spending that occurs in Washington before we look to new programs and services. Let's not make the cuts hurt. Let's be smart about the spending cuts and prioritize how we spend taxpayers' dollars. I have a biennial appropriations bill that would allow for each of the appropriations bills to be taken up over a 2-year period, with the more controversial bills being taken up after an election, and the easier bills taken up before the election, the next election. This would allow us to get into the spending details more, and we have $1 trillion in spending, and that's a lot of money in which to make annual decisions. We could eliminate duplication. We could give agencies stability for 2 years instead of 1. Let's stop making the spending cuts hurt. Let's get rid of what we really don't need and start living within our means. I want to thank my colleague, Senator Portman, for his leadership on the End Government Shutdowns Act. I'm a co-sponsor of this legislation that keeps the government open in the event of a lapse of funding, but which cuts 1% a quarter until each spending bill is enacted. It's a smart piece of legislation with incentives that'll bring people to the table to work out the differences on the spending bills. And what if we do spending bills one at a time and allow relevant amendments? That would speed up the process, but allow scrutinization beyond the Appropriations Committee. I don't think we have a spending problem. We have a revenue. We have a spending problem. We don't have a revenue problem. It's tough for accountants. We don't need to raise taxes in order for Washington to spend more. We cannot spend our way to prosperity. I'm a member of the Finance Committee. Let's open the doors for Senator Baucus and Congressman Camp to move forward expeditiously on tax reform. Let's make that happen. If done correctly, tax reform will help generate additional revenue through economic growth to reduce the deficits and pay down the debt. I'm ready to make that happen. My international tax plan would repatriate money at a low tax rate and bring the money back for jobs, and it scores positive. Some think all that is needed is to replace the year's automatic spending cuts as sequesters. What we need to do is prioritize those cuts, finding the spending cuts that will do the least harm, and start there. I worked in Wyoming, and it worked there, and it can work here. Our governor was faced with an 8% cut. So he had every agency list what they would cut at 2%, 4%, 6%, and 8%. And then he compared those lists to see what they really thought ought to be cut. We could do that too. Reining in out-of-control spending should be the path forward. Our nation's overspending has to stop. The latest Congressional Budget Office estimates show that deficits in the nation's debt are only going to get worse if we don't take action now, if we don't make cuts now. All the scenarios down the road are worse than what we're facing now. A little pain now is better than a lot of pain in the future. I look forward to a robust debate on our nation's fiscal path forward. I yield the floor.
Thank you. Next, Representative Black from Tennessee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. From the start of this process, everyone has asked about our expectations for this conference. Everyone wants to know what our expectations are for reaching a deal. And this isn't surprising, as has already been said. Anyone who can look at these two budget proposals forwarded by the House and the Senate and see that there are significant differences. But these differences really are only half of the story. And instead of focusing on these differences, we should focus on areas where we agree. After all, we all agree that our debt and deficits need to be addressed. We all agree that our economy is not growing nearly as fast as it should be. And I think we all agree that the best way to address these issues is through this process, through the regular order instead of the temporary short-term government funding measures. As a member elected in the wave of 2010, I came to Washington to work with my colleagues to make tough decisions and to protect the future of our country. My constituents sent me here to work towards solutions, to rein in our out-of-control spending, and to pursue policies that will help our economy grow. Our nation is now more than $17 trillion in debt, and our economy is so sluggish that a record 90 million Americans remain on the sidelines. They're not even looking for jobs. Household incomes are at historic lows, and unemployment remains unacceptably high. We need to get Americans back to work, and getting control of our debt will help our economy grow. And we all know that growing the economy is the best way to increase revenue and reduce our deficits. I have 3 children and 6 grandchildren, of which I'm very proud. And every day I worry about what this country will look like for them when they are my age. I'm sure most of my colleagues in this room have a similar concern about the future for their families and also for the American families all across this country. And so, my expectation is that everyone in this room will work together to help secure our future by making a down payment on our debt. My expectation is that we will work together to identify mutual, achievable goals that will help us reduce our deficits and get Americans back to work. And at the end of the day, I plan to tell my children and my grandchildren that I did everything I could to preserve the American dream for them and for all Americans. My expectation is that everyone on this budget conference will be able to say the same. I'm grateful to have the opportunity to join everyone here at the table, and I look forward to spending the time over the next several weeks finding that common ground. I also want to thank Congressman Ryan and Senator Murray for your leadership. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. Senator Stabenow.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I want to thank Chairman Murray for her important leadership as well. It's critical that we're sitting down in a bipartisan way to focus on our priorities as a nation. We know that government needs to do more with less. The good news is we are. We're streamlining government by getting rid of programs and policies that don't work and don't make sense. And we have already cut $2.5 trillion from the $4 trillion that everyone has talked about as a goal for reducing the debt over the next 10 years, $2.5 trillion. Together, we have the opportunity to take the next step in meeting that goal, a step that needs to be balanced in its approach using smart decisions, not reckless ones. As you know, I chair the Senate Agriculture Committee, and we took this approach on the Senate Farm Bill. When it becomes law, it will reduce the deficit by at least $20 billion by consolidating and streamlining programs, ending wasteful subsidies, and eliminating waste, fraud, and abuse while setting the right priorities for farmers and families. I served in the House with many of you the last time we actually balanced the budget. President Clinton was in office, and we balanced the budget for the first time in 30 years by making tough choices to grow the economy and strengthen the middle class. And we can do it again with a reasonable, balanced plan that doesn't sacrifice the future, that doesn't sacrifice opportunities and prosperity for middle-class families. As you know, a budget is a blueprint for the country we want to build together. It's a statement of our national priorities. And for me, the most important goal is to make sure the right people and the right priorities are at the front of the line. That means making sure our children have access to a quality education, from preschool to college. It means that when those children grow up, they can get good paying jobs so they can own a home and buy a car and raise a family. It means rebuilding our middle class by creating jobs and opportunities for small businesses, advanced manufacturing, innovative jobs that will fuel the economy for decades to come. And it means standing up for our seniors and retirees, protecting Medicare and Social Security benefits they have earned, not that they're entitled, they have earned after a lifetime of hard work. This budget needs to be about jobs and our economic plan for moving our country forward, because frankly, we're never going to get out of debt with more than 11 million people out of work. To move our country forward, it's essential that we stop the reckless policy of sequestration. The sequestration blindly cuts everything, things that are working, things that aren't, things that are important, things that aren't. It recklessly cuts health care for our veterans. It recklessly slashes funding for life-saving medical research. It recklessly cuts investments in education and innovation. And because of that reckless approach, we have seen sluggish job growth that is holding our economy back. And that makes absolutely no sense, Mr. Chairman. So I strongly agree with Chairman Murray that our #1 goal needs to be replacing the reckless sequester policy with a balanced, smart plan that continues the work we have done on deficit reduction while growing the economy for the future. I look forward to working with our conference committee, all colleagues on both sides of the aisle. Frankly, people across America are urging us to come together, as we know, to pass a bipartisan budget, and they're urging us to put middle-class families at the front of the line. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. We are finished with the House members, so we're going to just go right over to Mr. Crable.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and Chairman Murray. I've listened very carefully to the comments that have been made today, and I'm heartened by the fact that everyone recognizes that we need to come together and find the consensus and the common ground between us as we move forward. Senator Wyden mentioned that we should turn the current crisis into consensus, and we have that opportunity. I think it's important that we recognize some of the facts that we have to deal with as we achieve that. I've started to hear talk, not among us here, but I've started to hear talk recently that we don't really have a debt crisis anymore, that the Congress has been responsible in the past few years. We've passed $2.5 trillion of the $4 trillion that we needed to achieve, and that we are well on our way now to climbing out of the problem that we face. Well, the reality is that we do still have a debt crisis. The $2.5 trillion that is talked about is essentially made up of about $500 or $600 billion of tax increases, and a Budget Control Act that was passed in the face of the last fiscal crisis in 2011 that requires Congress to stick to that budget for 10 years. Anybody who has watched Congress and budgets knows that the record Congress has in sticking to its budget is deplorable. And one of the things that I think we ought to focus on is making sure that this $2.5 trillion that we all talk about is maintained. We have actually, and I think remarkably, stayed to that budget for the last couple of years, to the Budget Control Act. And as a result of that, at least with regard to discretionary spending, we are now starting to bend the curve down. And as I understand it, we are actually, if we stay on this course, going to be spending less in real dollars, not inflation-adjusted dollars, but less in real dollars in this fiscal year than we have in just a few years past. A remarkable achievement, but one that must be maintained. And I think as we talk about how to move forward, one of the first objectives we should have here in this conference is to protect and assure the reality of the fiscal reforms that we already have in place. Now, what am I talking about? I'm talking about focusing not just on some of the numbers in the budget and the spending, but focusing on some processes. I think one of the best things this committee could do is to establish some processes to help us move forward and assure and protect the existing achievements that have been made, budget enforcement processes that will help us assure that Congress sticks to the agreements that it does make on the budget, and then set forward some processes to help us move into the larger, what has been called grand bargains. I know that we don't have the time in this committee to put together the kind of large deal that would involve the tax reform, the entitlement reform, the fiscal reform, and the budget enforcement reform that all of us know needs to be done. But we can set up some processes to help us assure that the tax reform that we all talk about and are working on does move forward and move forward promptly. Processes that assure that Congress will not break its budget, as it has almost a perfect record of doing. Processes that will help us deal with future lapses in spending and potential government shutdowns in the way that Senator Portman's bill and others have proposed, to help us get a functioning and smoother process to deal with these crisis points that we seem to lurch between. Processes to help us deal with the debt ceiling as we reach the debt ceiling, and hopefully help us reduce the stress that we put on our economy in the political battles that we have here. I believe that we have a remarkable opportunity to focus on fixing some of the rules, some of the processes by which we function in this Congress in a way that will help us increase our ability to save to protect the savings that we now have, and to achieve further and greater savings as we move forward. So I would just encourage, as we work on all the other parts of the budget and all the other parts of the fiscal reform that are necessary, that we focus on laying the foundation for much greater and more effective results as we move forward beyond the activities of this committee. Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Sanders.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Senator Murray. And I think this has been a very good discussion, and I hope that we can continue to have more open discussions, because I think there are a lot of good ideas around this room. But let me begin my remarks with a radical proposal, if I might, and that is, let's listen to what the American people are telling us. You know, when we're at a 10% favorability rating, it might be a pretty good idea to do that. And what are the American people telling us? In poll after poll after poll, what they are saying is, do not cut Social Security, do not cut Medicare, do not cut Medicaid. That's what all the polls are telling us. The last one is the National Journal, tells us 81% of the American people do not want to cut Medicare benefits at all. 76% of the American people do not want to cut Social Security benefits at all, and 60% of the American people do not want to cut Medicaid benefits at all. Second of all, what else are the American people telling us? They say, yeah, deficit is a serious issue. And as Senator Crapo indicated, and I think we all know, we have made some progress in recent years. We've cut the deficit in half, not bad. And the American people want us to continue to do that. But you know what else they want us to do? In every poll that I have seen, you know what the top issue is? It is the economy and it is jobs. Representative Black made a good point. Real unemployment in this country is not 7.4%. It is close to 14% if you include those people who have given up looking for work and are working part-time when they want to work full-time. Youth unemployment, and the Pope, by the way, new Pope talks about this a lot. Youth unemployment is close to 20%. African-American youth unemployment is over 40%. And you know what the American people tell us in polls? They say, invest in the economy, create the millions of jobs that we need. Use government funds to rebuild our infrastructure. That is what the American people are telling us. And I think all of this comes from a fact that we do not talk about enough, and certainly the media doesn't talk about enough. As the American people look out, what do they see in the economy today? They see a middle class disappearing, 46.5 million people living in poverty. That is the highest we have ever been, while the wealthiest people in this country and the largest corporations are doing phenomenally well. So when the American people look around and talk about the deficit in jobs, what do they say? They say, do not balance the budget on the backs of the most vulnerable people in this country, the elderly, the children, the sick, working families, and the poor. But you know what they also say in polls and town meetings that I do, and I expect that you do? They say when the top 1% in the last few years have received 95% of all new income, you know what they say? Ask the millionaires and billionaires to pay a little bit more in taxes. Ain't gonna hurt them. And you know also they say? when we have record-breaking profits in corporate America, when Wall Street, that we bailed out a few years ago, is now doing phenomenally well, when 1 out of 4 major corporations in this country does not pay a nickel in taxes, then maybe it might be time to ask some of these large, profitable corporations who in some years pay nothing in federal income taxes to start paying their fair share. Who in this room is going to defend a situation where we lose $100 billion a year because multinational corporations are parking their profits in the Cayman Islands and in Bermuda and not paying a nickel in federal income taxes? Anyone think that's a particularly good idea? Senator Grassley raised a point a few moments ago about the defense budget. We are now spending almost as much as the rest of the world on defense. And we're not fighting the Soviet Union, we're fighting Al-Qaeda. Meanwhile, the Department of Defense can't even give us an audit. Does anyone here think we really can't cut money in the Defense Department? So I think if we look at a just, a moral solution and good economic sense, I think we can do deficit reduction. I think we've got to do that. But I think we've also got to create the millions of jobs that the American people understand we need to create. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I would yield the floor.
Thank you. Senator Graham.
I like Senator Sanders, but I disagree with virtually everything he said. And that brings us to what we're trying to do here, reconcile his worldview with mine. And they're different. It's like we're on different political planets here, but what is the nature of the problem? I mean, either we have almost a $17 trillion debt or we don't, and we do, and the question is why, and how do you turn it around? And as you look down the road, what drives the debt? 80 million baby boomers, Mr. Chairman, are going to, Madam Chairman, Mr. Chairman, whoever is running this thing, are going to retire in the next 30 or 40 years. Who replaces them in the workforce? That's why I think we need rational immigration reform, because our population growth is pretty much stagnant. 10,000 baby boomers a day are going into Medicare and Social Security. And when you combine the unfunded liability of these two programs, it's well over $50 trillion. And if you care about Social Security, we ought to try to save it. And if you care about Medicare, we ought to structurally change it so it'll be around for people after we're gone. And if you make $250,000 a year in retirement, the federal government subsidizes your Medicare Part B and D premium $108 a month. Is that really smart? When you're at $17 trillion, you say the American people don't want any change in Medicare. I bet you, Bernie, if you ask them that, they would say yes. You know, I don't make $250,000 in retirement, but if I did, I wouldn't want the government to give me any money that we can't afford to subsidize a premium I could pay. Now, if that's too much for the country to bear, then our best days are behind us. But it's not. The country will do what is required of the country because every generation before us has. Every generation before us has fought whatever war they had to fight, get through whatever problems they had to pass on to the next generation a chance to do better, and that's what this budget committee is about. There's two visions. Our House friends have tax reform without raising any revenue. You're able to take the money we have, you change the tax rates, you lower rates so we can create jobs like Senator Sanders wants, and our Democratic friends over the next decade increase taxes by $900 billion. Over the next decade, the House Republican bill reduces spending by $4.6 trillion. Over the next decade, our Democratic friends increase spending by $265 billion. Two different views of where we want to go and how we create jobs and what's the proper sustainable role of the federal government. Let's pledge to do this, not shut the government down. Bernie and I are on different planets, but between now and January the 13th, I hope we can find a way to fund this government through September. That would be good for all of us. And we're not going to be able to reconcile our different visions between now and September, but we should be able to fund the government. As to the Defense Department, you say it is well funded. I say we're on a course to gut the Defense Department and the intelligence community over the next decade at the time we need it the most, that historically about 4% of GDP, almost 5%, has been spent on defense. At the end of the sequester in year 10 is well under 3%. And if you're looking at the next decade as a decade of safety for the American people, we're again on different planets. I look at the next decade as a challenge to keep radical Islam from acquiring weapons that could kill millions of Americans, not thousands. The reason 3,000 Americans died on 9/11, they couldn't get the weapons to kill 3 million of us. If they could, they would. And they're ever so close. Iran is marching toward a nuclear weapon, not a power plant. Syria is fractured and chemical weapons abound in the Mideast in Syria, and God knows where they're going to wind up. So I would argue that our intelligence community and our Defense Department is going to be crippled beyond measure if we continue with sequestration. But having said that, a deal is a deal, and we're going to hold these numbers. There's a reasonable entitlement reform that could replace defense and non-defense sequestration over the next 30 years. You could look out and see how much money you save, take pressure off the NIH as well as DOD. I hope we can do that. Maybe we won't do that between now and January. So to my colleagues, first things first, find a way to fund the government in the next coming year, and slowly but surely find a way to bridge the gap between the world that Bernie sees and Lindsay sees. Because if we can't bridge that gap, then our best days are behind us, and that would be a shame.
Thank you. Senator Whitehouse.
And thank you, Chairman Murray, from my Budget Committee. We are still recovering from the worst recession of our lifetimes and a foolhardy shutdown. A harmful budget sequester is eroding our economy, and a debt limit once again looms. So we have serious work to do. In poll after poll, Americans have been clear that the most urgent issue facing their families is the weak economy and a lack of jobs. Unfortunately, federal budget policy in recent years has been dragged down the dangerous austerity path and largely ignored the role that, for instance, infrastructure, research, and energy efficiency can play in supporting our economy and jobs. Europe's austerity experiments inflicted significant economic harms while not delivering the promised budget improvements. At home, the dangers of austerity budgeting show in the sequester, which, to its credit, was designed to be stupid and painful and has filled that bill. In August, I heard from Rhode Islanders about layoffs in the defense industry, civilian personnel forced to take unpaid leave, children unable to enroll in Head Start, and a cruel $40 a week cut to unemployment insurance while my state is still hovering around 9% nominal unemployment. Actual unemployment, as Bernie's pointed out, much higher. But we also heard about more lasting damage. Karen Markin is the Director of Research Development at our University of Rhode Island. She said, I'll quote her, "These budget cuts are insidious because we won't feel the consequences for a few years. And when we do, it'll be subtle, but devastating in the long run. It will be the absence of innovations in science, technology, and medicine at the pace we've come to expect. It's like deferred maintenance that seems innocuous now, but it will come back to bite us several years from now. We can probably recover from a single year of treading water in scientific discovery, but if this keeps up, the nation's scientific research enterprise will begin to erode. And China and other nations are not going to step out of the competition while we inflict this damage on ourselves. We must replace the sequester with policies that support job growth. Our efforts to date have been heavily in the form of spending cuts. Of the $2.5 trillion in deficit reduction since 2011, cutting spending on government programs has been $1.5 trillion. Additional revenue has been only $600 billion, and the difference has been interest savings. What has been at zero through this entire exercise is another costly area of federal spending. We have done nothing on federal spending through the tax code. I say to all of my fellow conferees, you cannot honestly say that the debt and deficit are mortal threats to our nation and at the same time less important than every tax loophole in the code. That cannot be our position. Our Senate budget generates $975 billion from loophole closing, and I'd urge everyone to take an honest look
at this untouched form of spending, tax spending through our tax code. The tax loopholes I'd like to devote to deficit reductions are ones we should get rid of anyway. Big oil does not need taxpayer subsidies. Companies should not be rewarded for shifting assets to foreign countries. Billionaires should not pay lower tax rates than brick masons. Correcting these flaws would be fair and help us create jobs and grow the economy. I'll close on health care. The potential savings from healthcare delivery system reform are enormous. Experts from the President's Council of Economic Advisors to the Lewin Group and former Bush Treasury Secretary O'Neill to the Institutes of Medicine estimate $700 billion to $1 trillion a year in nationwide healthcare savings, without compromising health outcomes, likely by improving the quality and experience of care Americans see. Addressing things like medical errors and our backwards payment structure. Since over 40% of total health spending is federal, that means huge potential federal savings. In fact, according to CBO, progress has begun. Since 2010, when the Bowles-Simpson Commission recommended we cut our deficits by $4 trillion, we've seen CBO's estimates for Medicare and Medicaid drop by $1.2 trillion. Substantial savings that have not been included in the official deficit reduction tallies. So I look forward to working with conferees on both sides to support policies to deliver the savings and better health care Americans deserve.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Senator Warner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Senator Murray, as well. I also have been listening to a lot of our colleagues around the table. I actually think there are some agreements and obviously some major challenges of disagreement. I've got 3 touchstones that I hope will come out of this effort. First, let's try to agree to do no harm, which would mean, and I think we've heard this from lots of folks, that another government shutdown or threatening the full faith and credit of the United States of America does no good at all and presents an enormous economic crisis. I think, again, that we all will have our numbers on what the price was, but it was unnecessary, unprecedented. We all have our fun factoids about the shutdown. Mine is the fact that during the shutdown, we actually furloughed 3 American Nobel Prize winners in physics. You kind of wonder, what do the folks in China, India, Russia, around the rest of the world think when we were furloughing those kind of American assets? And I can assure you those countries did not put their research on hold during our period of dysfunction. Second, and I think we've heard a lot of commonality on this, let's remember that sequestration was supposed to be set up to be so bad that no rational group of people would let it happen. And I think there's a way that we can protect the savings but find ways to replace it. I know some of my colleagues may think that, well, it's not really been that bad. I actually believe, similar to Senator Whitehouse's comments, that it's almost like a cancer inside. I can tell you perhaps Virginia, Senator Kaine may mention this as well, we're a little bit of ground zero, particularly because of our combinations with the military. What we are doing in terms of hurting military readiness, what we are doing in terms of costing taxpayers money because we're not able to do the long-term purchase contracts that DOD has operated in the past is totally irresponsible. I know a lot of us around this table like to cite, business experience. I'm still proud of the fact that I was a business guy longer than I've been on the political side, and my time in business was mostly spent as an investor. And if you're looking at investing on any business plan, you really look at 3 things. You look at a company's plan for their workforce, a company's plan for investment in plant and equipment, and a company's plan on how they're going to stay ahead of the competition. Countries have a business plan too. We call it our budget. We have those 3 items as well. Workforce is education and training, plant and equipment's infrastructure, and staying ahead of the competition is research and development. And while I strongly believe most of our job growth is going to come from the private sector, the government does provide a framework in those 3 areas to allow the private sector to prosper. And unfortunately, if we go forward with approaches that indiscriminately cut those areas of investment in infrastructure, education, and R&D, we're not going to have a business plan that long-term, I think, will allow our country to prosper. So let's find a way that we can find that common agreement to replace sequester and make some investments in those key areas. Third, and this is, I know, maybe a little bit off script, I actually hope that we might be able to exceed expectations. I think we've done an appropriate job of lowering expectations so that the simply avoiding crisis may be viewed as a success. But I think while we may not be able to get to the so-called grand bargains, that we ought to have used this opportunity to, to recognize that if we keep coming back to the discretionary bucket, whether it's on the defense side or the non-defense side, that it becomes a zero-sum game after a period. And I would say, as somebody who acknowledges we need to look at entitlements, when we hear these constant references to 50-year revenue totals, I just think it refuses to recognize some of the fundamental changes in where our economy is right now. We've seen, I'll just cite two, a dramatic transfer from the private sector to the public sector of research and development expenses, not just in America, but it's all across the world. There is no such thing as a Bell Labs anymore. And increasingly, if we're going to stay competitive, the public sector is going to pick up R&D. And because we've been blessed with a much longer lifetime ability, the entitlement cost, even with entitlement reforms, are going to be greater than we've seen in the past because of 80-plus year living expectations. So I hope and pray that we actually are willing. We all kind of know what we're going to have to deal with. Democrats are going to have to deal with entitlement reforms. Republicans are going to have to deal with revenues. And we ought to be willing to at least approach those areas. I would close with simply saying we all have lots of ideas about how we can grow our economy. I think there would be nothing that would do more for job creation and economic growth than removing this fiscal overhang of governing by crisis. And I hope that we could do that and exceed those expectations.
Thank you, Senator Warner. Senator Toomey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks for laying out the macro challenge that we face. I think you did a very good job of that, Mr. Chairman, and I won't repeat that. I will second my friend from Virginia's hope that we could achieve something broader than the more modest goals that we've been discussing. But I also suspect that a grand bargain, something on a very large magnitude, will probably elude us. And so I would like to suggest that we shoot for three modest goals, modest but achievable goals in my view, and goals that have all enjoyed bipartisan support at various levels in the recent past. And so I'd like to walk briefly through what those goals are, Mr. Chairman. First, I want to say I think it's vitally important that we preserve the savings that are embodied in the BCA. Let's remember, this was a promise we made to the American people in return for adding over $2 trillion of debt to the nation's balance sheet. We agreed to some modest reductions in the growth in discretionary spending over 10 years in return for that. I would also strongly underscore the fact that government is not the source of wealth and prosperity in this country, nor any other country, nor has it ever been. It is the private sector that is the source of wealth and employment and innovation and job growth, and government lives off that. And to the extent that we can curb the size and the spending of government, we will have more prosperity, more job growth, and a higher standard of living. And that's part of why I think it's so important that we keep this modicum of spending discipline that we agreed to broadly and that President Obama signed into law in 2011. Let me also make the case that the cuts of the BCA put us on a more sustainable and frankly a very reasonable trajectory. The chart that we have posted illustrates this. If we had grown discretionary spending since 2000 at the rate of population growth plus inflation, we would have been on that green dotted line. Instead, of course, we had a huge surge in spending over the last 10 years. And what the BCA caps do is they return us to that trajectory over time, gradually. Now, I'll be the first to say I am very open to alternative ways of achieving the spending discipline. I'm not suggesting that we have to enact exactly this mechanism. But I do think it's vitally important that we achieve the savings that they contemplate. That's my first point. Second point is, I wasn't in favor of the strategy that led to the shutdown. I'm not sure anybody in this room was, but we got there. And when we get there, this kind of government by manufactured crisis is a disaster for the American people and for our economy. So let's acknowledge the fact that no one of us here can control the appropriations process. I mean, we had only one appropriation bill on the Senate floor last year. And since we can't control that process, let's change the mechanism. Let's put in place a standing mechanism that will prevent this from ever happening again. And so I'm a big supporter of Senator Portman's bill that simply says that in the event that we run out of a fiscal year without having passed appropriation bills, let's just automatically continue funding. Let's take a government shutdown completely off the table. Let's just continue funding at the previous year's level until we can pass the appropriation bills that we should have passed. Finally, we also know that we have a dynamic in place whereby the appropriation bills might exceed the statutory spending caps. And if they do, we have a mechanism that's highly suboptimal, right? It has this across-the-board spending cuts. And so I'm an advocate for giving the administration some flexibility. If they need to make these spending cuts to live within the caps, let's allow them to use the common sense that every business and family would use. Cut the least important things, preserve the most important things. It is not true that all federal spending is equally important. We know that. And so let's give the administration some flexibility to manage this. Remember, we had a big argument over the FAA funding when the sequester first kicked in earlier this year, and some threatened that it was going to be a catastrophe if they had to live with the cuts. Turns out that a bipartisan bill signed into law by President Obama giving the FAA authority to have some flexibility in managing the cuts allowed them to get through the sequester with no furloughs, no layoffs, no canceled flights, no control towers closed, no disruptions. That model could be applied more broadly, and we can achieve the savings in a more sensible fashion. So, Mr. Chairman, I hope we'll be able to work together on even more ambitious goals, but if we can't achieve those, I hope we can achieve this: savings, some flexibility, and preventing government by manufactured crisis. Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Merkley.
Thank you, Chairman Murray and Chairman Ryan. It is a privilege to be in this room and to seek a path to invest in America and enhance the success of American families. Over the last several years, repeated uncertainty and brinksmanship manufactured here in the Capitol have done the opposite, hurting families and businesses across our country. The massive drop in the stock market during the 2011 debt limit debate, to the $24 billion lost in the economy during the government shutdown, to the missed opportunities that address our real challenges, Washington's dysfunction has detracted from our progress in the area that matters most to families across this country: the economy and jobs, living wage jobs. The families who live in my neighborhood are worried about holding on to a living wage job if they are so fortunate as to still have one. They're worried about how to afford to send their kids to college and whether kids will have a big debt and no job when they graduate. They're worried about retirement. And the families that live in my neighborhood, like working families across this nation, are disturbed and angry to see our government lurching from crisis to crisis, and these crises must end. But avoiding the next shutdown is not enough. We need to get back to the basics that make our economy tick: good jobs and infrastructure, affordable, high-quality education, retirement, secure retirement for middle-class working Americans. These are things that strengthen our economy in the long term. So let's examine our priorities, as folks on both sides of the aisle have suggested. Why do we still have tax breaks for companies that ship our jobs overseas when we can't fund the infrastructure and maintain the existing infrastructure for manufacturers to succeed here in America? Why do we have loopholes that give billions to oil companies while Head Start programs have had to turn away eligible children across our nation? In every single state represented in this room, and in every other state, there are empty chairs. Empty chairs that represent a broken promise to the next generation, and those empty chairs should haunt us. If we continue to avoid these kinds of choices, we will lose the middle class that has made America the greatest economic engine in the world. Crushing the American dream for millions of working families while giving away the national treasury to the few best off is unacceptable. Let's be clear. We can invest in America and simultaneously reduce the deficit. Indeed, ending tax ripoffs and growing a successful economy, creating living wage jobs, puts these two goals, thriving American families and reducing the deficit, in a compatible framework. I stand ready, as I know everyone here does, to work within this committee conversation and dialogue to find a path forward. American people expect us to find common ground, expect us to find a steady course. So let's come together, work to end the constant crises, strengthen the economy, and rebuild the American class. Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Portman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I have a brilliant statement with a strong assist from my staff that I'd like to submit for the record. And I was here earlier and had the opportunity to hear from a number of my colleagues. And I guess I feel like we have an opportunity here, but not meeting again until, it sounds like, mid-November. We've got a lot of work we need to do among ourselves. And I hope that Republican and Democrat alike will be willing to do that and figure out how we can take this opportunity that's been presented to us to really make a difference. And I'd like to simplify it to just 3 things. You know, we haven't met for 4 years, I guess, as a budget conference. And during that interim period, we've added $5.9 trillion to the debt since there was a budget conference last. And that's about $50,000 per household. So I don't think we're going to do a grand bargain here. I'd like to. I'm sure a lot of us would. But I think we can do something that moves us in the right direction. And we can call it a good bargain for the American people. And again, I think there are 3 elements to it. One is, let's do something on the mandatory side. All of us know that's the problem. We've done a pretty good job on the discretionary side. The Budget Control Act was only signed into law 2 years ago. Let's not break those caps. But let's acknowledge that we've done a pretty good job on the 1/3 of the government spending that's subject to appropriations. The 2/3 that's on autopilot is the part that we're not doing a good job on. It's going to grow to 76% in the next 10 years. The health care entitlements in there alone are going to grow by over 100% in the next 10 years. It will bankrupt the country if we don't deal with it. So we've got to do something, in my view, to be viewed as credible, to be able to do at least a good bargain for the American people on the mandatory side, and specifically something on the entitlements. These are vital programs. They're the safety net. We all want to preserve them and protect them, but they are not sustainable in their current form, and we all know that. There's no secret about it. So my thought was, gosh, at least let's do something on the entitlement side, not a, again, grand bargain, but something relatively small, provide some relief on the sequester side, as has been talked about earlier today, and show the American people we can make some progress on this 2/3 of the budget that right now is kind of off limits. No one's talking about. Second, economic growth. Everybody's talked about it. My friend and former colleague Jim Clyburn had a chart up showing this amazing correlation between where deficits are and where unemployment is. And he sort of made one side of it, which is the fact you can't get the deficit under control unless you get people back to work. I totally agree with that. I think the converse is also true. I don't think we're going to see a robust economic recovery that we all hope for unless we take this wet blanket off the economy. And that's this amazing level of debt and deficit. We've never had it before. It's unprecedented. People say, well, as a percent of GDP, we had it one other time just during World War II. Well, yeah, but we didn't have the long-term liabilities that we now have. This is unprecedented, and it is impacting the economy. Talk to anybody back home, I'm sure you do all the time, as I do, who's thinking about investing, creating something, an innovator, job creator. This is a factor. So I hope we'll do something on the growth side, not just in terms of dealing with the mandatory spending, which again I think is very much related to what Jim Clyburn showed us in terms of that chart, but also on tax reform. Because all of us, I think, agree, and I just heard my colleague from Oregon talking about the tax system. The current system is antiquated. I love what Ron Wyden said. It's 100 years old, and it looks like it. And it's obvious to me that this is urgent. It's urgent in the corporate side, by the way, because we're losing people and capital and investment and headquarters overseas. Right now, as we're talking, companies are making a decision not to be American companies because of our tax code that is not competitive. We're not going to do it in the next 18 legislative days. Let's face it, this group isn't going to do tax reform. But we could put together instructions for tax reform that say, okay, let's facilitate and expedite the process. I know Chairman Camp wants to do that. I know Chairman Baucus wants to do that. I'm not quite sure where the leadership is on all this, but I think we as a group could say, you know, we agree not as to whether we should raise taxes or cut taxes or whatever. Republicans are going to be probably for revenue neutral reform. Democrats are going to want to raise revenue. That's not the debate we have to have now. We can put off that discussion until we do the substantive tax reform, but let's say in the next 3 months we're going to do it. We've had dozens of hearings. We have a consensus, I believe, that's growing about how we do this to grow the economy, and it's broadening the base, lowering the rate, yeah, getting rid of a lot of the preferences we're talked about today, the loopholes and so on. Let's do it with tax reform that really grows the economy. And the final thing I want to say, which is maybe a relatively small matter, but I think it's important, if we could stop government shutdowns through our work here, not by passing legislation, because we can't do that, but by proposing that we have a legislative fix like the End Government Shutdown Act. I know some have talked about it here today. I think that would make sense. And what it says is, if you haven't finished your appropriations bills by September 30, whatever bills are not done, you simply have the same spending from the previous year. And yeah, then it ratchets down in 120 days by 1%, and then another 1% over the next 60 days. It's not anti-appropriator. It's pro-appropriator. I'm not an appropriator, but there are some around the table who are and are concerned about it. I think it would encourage the appropriations committees to get their work done. That's the whole point. I mean, it's been 4 years since we had a budget conference. In the last 4 years in the Senate, only one appropriation bill has been done at a time out of 48. So I hope that we can focus on what's doable, take a step in the right direction, and come up with a good bargain for the American people. Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I really hope America is watching this hearing. I've said repeatedly about those dinners we had with President Obama that if Americans could have been a fly on the wall, they would have been heartened by those discussions. I think they should be heartened by this one as well. I think there's a genuine interest here in solving these problems. I think that's a good thing. Now, I appreciate that Senator Sessions pointed out that I have a business background, and I do, and I've learned a lot of lessons in business, and I've done a lot of negotiating. And the first thing I learned is a pretty good start to any negotiation. Spend a lot of time on the front end of any negotiation, figuring out what you agree on. And we've had that mentioned around the table quite a bit here. And we've talked about things we agree on. I think most of us agree on. Let's not shut down the government. So I totally support Senator Portman's bill on that. But let's talk about one big thing that I truly believe we all agree on. We share the same goal. I certainly want a prosperous America. I'm concerned about every American. I want every American to have the opportunity to build a good life for themselves and their family. I think everybody around this table, I think everybody serving in Congress shares that goal. So I'll be the first to admit that we have, a wide disparity of opinions in terms of how you achieve that goal. But as we move forward with these discussions, trying to deal and grapple with these enormous problems, let's not question each other's motives. It's just not helpful. It's not going to solve the problem. I think the other thing that, certainly my business background brings to the table is how do you solve a problem? I've solved a lot of problems in manufacturing. You always go to the root cause. But there's just a process that you go through to solve a problem that works. And almost any problem-solving process starts with the first thing is admitting you have a problem. And then that's followed almost immediately by defining it properly. And one of the things I'd like to do in hopefully open hearings in this process is let's define that problem. In negotiating, for example, if you've got a seller of a business on one side of the table with one set of books and me being the buyer on the other set, wildly different. I'll guarantee you will never come to a successful negotiation. You actually have to have an agreed upon audited set of books. So I would argue that we're not dealing with a 10-year budget problem here. We're really dealing with a 30-year demographic baby boom generation retiring problem. Because if we just deal with a 10-year problem, we are dramatically understating the size of the problem. And so, I just couldn't resist. I've got a big screen TV here. I've got to throw a couple charts on here. I think I have some time. Here's the CBO's latest long-term projection. Over the next 3 decades, we are going to experience in the first decade a $6.3 trillion deficit. Second decade, $16.5 trillion. Third decade, $33.6 for a whopping total of $56 trillion. Now, in our discussions with the White House, we put together some projections as well. I came up with a $107 trillion deficit over the next 30 years. We can view that as a range. I don't care which number you pick. It's a big problem. It's one that needs to be addressed. The sooner the better. Next chart. I hear all the time that Social Security is solvent to the year 2033. Only because of the fiction of the Social Security Trust Fund, which I don't have time to get into. But here's the facts in terms of the cash deficit. The next decade, Social Security will pay out $1.1 trillion more in benefits than they're going to receive in terms of payroll tax. The second decade, $4 trillion. The third decade, $7.6 trillion for a whopping total over 30 years of a $12.7 trillion decade. I don't think any of us here in Washington can look the American people in the eye and honestly say that is a solvent program. It needs to be saved for future generations. And by the way, Chairman Ryan can attest to this. It's not particularly popular for Republicans trying to reform these programs. It's not like, hey, we are insisting on this. We feel we have to do it. So we stop mortgaging our children's future. Last slide. Republicans want to increase revenue to the federal government. We agree with that goal. We just want to do it the old-fashioned way by growing our economy. And here's proof of how growing our economy is far more effective than punishing success. Since 2009, the low water mark in terms of revenue generation, we have increased revenue to the federal government by $1.2 trillion. That's the revenue increase. In just last year alone, we've added $672 billion per year of revenue, even with meager economic growth. That little yellow thing on top there, that's the $27 billion that was added because of the tax increase in the fiscal cliff deal. And that's an important point to make. So yeah, we agree on economic growth. There's a lot of things we can agree on. Let's work together to solve these problems. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Senator Coons.
Thank you, Chairman Ryan. I'd like to thank Chairman Ryan and Chairman Murray for convening this Budget Committee conference. And I can agree with Senator Johnson that we both worked in manufacturing and that we both think that getting back to focusing on economic growth and jobs is a top priority. My hope is that as we work together in this conference committee, we will find ways to end the disagreements and differences that have recently shut the government and instead focus on the things that we all agree we want to do together, which is to grow the economy, create good jobs, and reduce our deficits. And the challenges facing us are well documented and widely known. But if we're going to get back to working together on creating jobs and reducing our deficits, we've got to start by figuring out what we do really agree on so we can find common ground and move forward. That's the way Delawareans ask me every day to work here in Washington. So I'd like to just briefly outline what I think are the priorities that actually unite us. We can safely agree we do all want to grow the economy, to grow good jobs and grow federal revenue. After the collapse of 2008 to 2009, we've had 40 straight quarters of consecutive job growth, but our recovery is still fragile. The national unemployment rate, as several senators and congressmen have said, is far too high. We've got 32,000 unemployed in Delaware, but more than 11 million nationwide, and we've got record rates of poverty and of income inequality that are serious challenges. In all of this, economic growth has to be our North Star. As many of us know, if we grow our economy just 1 percentage point more, we would not just reduce our deficit more than $500 billion over a decade, but we would grow 1 million new jobs. So what are the things we could agree on to grow the economy? First, replacing the harmful effects of the sequester. CBO estimates sequester will cost 750,000 jobs this year and even more damage next year. Second, invest in a skilled workforce. Work in partnership with the private sector to deal with significant workforce skills deficits. There were 600,000 unfilled manufacturing jobs this past year. We need to work together to train our workers. Third, research and development, as several members have said, is absolutely critical to our long-term competitiveness. R&D generates new ideas, new products, in some cases whole new industries, fueling our ability to compete successfully with other countries. Finally, we have a crumbling infrastructure. As we all know, there are far too many highways, ports, tunnels, bridges that are critical to our economic growth, that are well below international standards. We have to invest in order to grow. But frankly, most importantly, we can all agree. Coming to some agreement in a reasonable time frame is probably the most important thing this committee can do to help grow our economy. And doing it on a timeline that allows the Appropriations Committee to then deliver a result without shutting down the government or putting it at any risk is about the best thing we could do. I will agree, though, that we can't simply grow our way out of our problems. We do have to address the drivers of our debt and deficits. We have to continue to reduce our deficits, which we've cut in half over the last 4 years. If we don't, interest expense is a very real threat for crowding out both public and private investment in education, in R&D, and in infrastructure. Over the last 3 years, we've made real strides in reducing our deficits. We've saved more than $2.5 trillion. Yet that's been really unbalanced. About 70% of it has been from spending cuts, while only about 30% from revenue. We need to do more, but we have to do it, I believe, in a balanced way. We've heard from several senators about the need to modernize the tax code, about the need to move towards real tax reform. And while this committee can't get all of that done, we can move in that direction in a substantial way. Making a modest cut of only 5% of the $1 trillion a year we spend through the tax code would make a huge dent in our deficits. Last, we do have to continue to make some reductions in direct spending, although I'll note that's the areas that has taken the hardest hit. And I will insist on doing so in a way that puts a circle of protection around the most vulnerable in our country and that honors our promises to our seniors, to our veterans, and to those about to retire to protect them from hurtful cuts. Chairman Ryan, Chairman Murray, I'm glad we've come together. I think we need to focus not on our areas of disagreement, but on priorities we all share, focusing on growth, replacing sequester, reducing the deficit, and ensuring our long-term prosperity. Thank you.
Thank you. I've learned something. I now know you refer to yourselves as Delawareans. So next time I'm in Smyrna, I'll use that. Thanks. Senator Ayotte.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you and thank Chairman Murray for your leadership and everyone at the table who is coming here, I think, in a spirit of good faith so that we can resolve this for the nation. And I represent Granite Staters, and I can tell you that they're not happy when you think about where we are. We reached a milestone that none of us are proud of recently with $17 trillion of debt for our nation. I'm blessed to be the mother of 2 children, a 6-year-old and a 9-year-old. And it's not just words when we think about what is it that we are passing on to the next generation. If those of us who are in a position around this table to address the fiscal challenges facing our nation kick the can down the road again and don't get things done to address those challenges. I like to say that the debt is really a function of both parties, because it is. It took Democrats and Republicans to get us in $17 trillion of debt. We added $4.9 trillion to the debt during President Bush's 8 years in office. Since the President Obama has been in office, we've added $6.4 trillion to the debt. So the truth is, it is going to take 2 parties to get us out of this mess, and the American people expect us to work together to do it. So what are the big challenges that we face? I think my colleague Senator Graham talked about them. One of them is Medicare is going bankrupt in 2026. Social Security goes bankrupt in 2033. The mandatory spending piece of what we spend our dollars on is 2/3 of federal spending. CBO's long-term outlook in the next 25 years, it looks worse for our nation, not better. And in fact, those important programs that I just talked about, the mandatory spending entitlement programs, they're going to squeeze out the discretionary priorities that we also care about, defense, infrastructure, and education. So if we don't take on those larger challenges, then the people who are relying on those programs, we are not doing a service to them, because they are important for our nation, and they are important to, I know, many of my constituents and others who are relying on them for a secure retirement and future. So my hope is that we can lay a foundation for a larger fiscal agreement for the country, as my colleague Senator Crapo talked about. Because if we don't get at these underlying fiscal challenges, then we're going to continue to be where we are today. The one thing I do hope we can agree on is let's not kick the can down the road again. Since fiscal year 2011, we've had 16 continuing resolutions. Think about it. Short-term funding pieces. Anyone who interacts with the government has no certainty in the private sector in terms of what we're going to do next. No one would run a business this way. No one would run a family this way. And I hope that at a minimum, around this table, we can agree to fund the government through the end of the fiscal year and commit to ourselves that there won't be any more government shutdowns. I commend my colleague, Senator Portman, for his End Government Shutdowns Act. I'm also a co-sponsor of that. But shame on us if we don't at least come up with a funding measure till the end of this fiscal year and end this government by crisis, because my constituents are tired of it. I'm sure everyone around this table hears the same thing from their constituents. Finally, if you look at the Budget Control Act, I didn't vote for the Budget Control Act. The reason for that was because it didn't deal with the underlying long-term drivers of our debt. And I hope that we do get at that larger fiscal agreement for the country. That said, with $17 trillion in debt, the savings that we are realizing from the Budget Control Act should not be ignored, should not be blown off. Are there smarter ways that we can address spending? Absolutely. Because the Budget Control Act takes all those savings out of about a third of federal spending, instead of looking at the big picture and the big challenges that we face. I had the chance to meet with General Odierno this morning. I serve on the Armed Services Committee, the Chief of Staff of the Army. We only have 2 brigades that are prepared for combat right now. So the impacts that we are having by only taking a third and cutting from that third and not looking at the big picture is something that we should care about in this committee. And I'm hoping that we can come to some ways to do this in a smarter fashion. Number one, through dealing through waste, fraud, and abuse. How many GAO reports have we all seen around this table on duplicative programs that have never been addressed? Let's address them finally. And in addition to that, the President proposed some spending reductions from mandatory savings. Let's see if we can work together to do this in a much smarter way, make sure that our nation can be defended, and also, finally, let's not kick the can down the road. I said it a third time, but let's show the American people we can get something done on their behalf, and that we end government by crisis, that we get out of our trenches on both sides of the aisle and get this done for the American people. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Next from a Wisconsinite, Senator Baldwin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's nice to have a reunion with some of my former colleagues, and I also want to recognize the leadership of Chairman Murray. Well, I've heard some real notes of agreement, including the obvious that the American people are sick and tired. They're exhausted of our governing from manufactured crisis to manufactured crisis. And we know that their faith in us has been badly eroded. But one thing that we have heard echoed around this table today, and I'm heartened by that, is that we need to pass a budget that grows our economy. So it's time to do just that. It's time for both parties to work together to find the common ground and move a responsible budget forward that invests in economic growth. As we begin this budget conference, I think it's important that we acknowledge what has been done so far. In the past 3 years, significant progress has been made in achieving $2.5 trillion in bipartisan deficit reduction measures. This is more than halfway to a $4 trillion target that was laid out by bipartisan fiscal commissions like the Simpson-Bowles Commission. While we need to do more, we must do it in a way that is balanced and doesn't put up a roadblock for moving our economic recovery forward. Quite frankly, the biggest roadblocks to our economic recovery have come from the broken politics of this city. The government shutdown cost our economy more than 120,000 jobs in October alone, and continued sequester cuts are predicted to cost as many as 1.6 million jobs next year if kept in effect. We have the chance in this conference to leave that damaging path. A new path is before us, and the American people expect us to take it together. The middle-class families and small businesses that are working so hard to move our economic recovery forward deserve to have both parties in Washington working across party lines to pass a bipartisan budget that creates jobs and grows our economy. And in order to do this, we know we have to work together. The common refrain that we often hear in Washington is that Republicans won't yield on any revenues and Democrats won't yield on any changes to programs like Medicare and Medicaid. To be clear, the Senate Democratic budget includes revenues from cutting tax expenditures and closing tax loopholes. It also includes smart and targeted spending cuts, and it includes $275 billion in entitlement savings, achieved without cutting Medicare benefits that seniors have earned and rely upon. The House Republican budget has significant cuts to benefits and provides economic security to millions, the House Republican budget has significant cuts to Medicare benefits. Those are the very benefits that provide economic security to millions of middle-class families. And it has $0 of revenues which could be used to invest in the essential pillars of economic growth, like education, workforce readiness, science, research, and innovation. I believe that there are significant savings that can be achieved in our healthcare system without compromising the quality of care, and in fact, while improving the quality of care, and without slashing benefits that our seniors have worked so hard for and earned. The Lewin Group and former Treasury Secretary Paul O'Neill have estimated that we could save $1 trillion per year without affecting healthcare outcomes and by enacting smart, targeted healthcare delivery reforms. The Institute of Medicine estimated this number could be $750 billion. No matter what the exact figure or proposal, these are impressive savings that would strengthen our nation's healthcare system without shifting costs and burdens to seniors and our states. In addition, these reforms have the added benefit of improving quality outcomes within the healthcare system. So before we continue to obsessively put benefit cuts on the table, I would hope that we can begin a dialogue about finding solutions that produce healthcare cost savings. And I'm confident that if both parties in Washington do what the people do every day in the state of Wisconsin, put progress ahead of politics, we can break this destructive pattern and we can make that progress.
Thank you. Senator Wicker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Madam Chairwoman. Let me agree with Senator Baldwin. We need to find solutions. We need to show the American people that we're problem solvers. Senator Johnson's charts were painful, but they make the point that has been made over and over today, and that is that we have a debt crisis and we're still headed in the wrong direction. As Senator Sessions began, the deficit is down, but it's down on a temporary basis. It will soon rise again to $1 trillion per year. So we are in a weak recovery, and we have not turned the corner, and we shouldn't approach this budget as if we've turned the corner. Nobody likes sequestration. I don't like sequestration, but I can live with it. Indeed, under sequestration, discretionary spending begins to rise after fiscal year 2015. It's not ideal, it's not the best, but it is the law, and without replacing it with better savings, we must keep sequestration. Now, Senator Warner, I will support additional revenues, but as Chairman Ryan pointed out, and as Senator Enzi made clear, those additional revenues must come through economic growth. I think we can do that. I'm equally certain that Republicans in Congress will not support tax increases, either directly or indirectly, either through the front door or the back door. Asking American workers to send more of their paychecks to Washington will hurt growth. And similarly, taking more tax dollars from job creators will result in fewer jobs. I agree exactly with what Senator Grassley said. The $600 billion tax hike that came with the fiscal cliff legislation at the end of last year was our tax hike. We've gotten our tax hike, and we will not support another one. Let's explore Representative Cole's idea of an expedited tax reform process to get us the pro-growth tax policies that will give us the additional revenue we need. And lastly, my colleagues, let's explore enacting the mandatory savings contained in President Obama's own budget. President Obama has outlined budget savings in our entitlement programs. They were courageous, they were difficult, but they don't cut benefits. These proposals don't cut Social Security. They do not cut Medicaid. No one is suggesting, as has been alluded to or been suggested by some members of this conference committee, that there's a proposal to slash benefits or cut benefits. All we're talking about, and all the president is talking about in his mandatory proposed savings in his own budget, is slowing the growth rate of these very important programs to save our nation from a fiscal and debt crisis and to save these very valuable programs. I think those are the sweet spots. Tax reform to give us economic growth and savings in the growth rate of our mandatory programs. I hope we can rise to the occasion and be problem solvers for the American people.
Thank you. Senator Kane.
Thank you, Chairman Ryman, Chairwoman Murray. It's good to be with colleagues on this, and there's a lot of things we want to do. One of the things I want to do is confound all the cynics who have such low expectations of us. There's been years of budgetary dysfunction, and there has not been a budget conference in a divided Congress since 1986. So we start with a low expectation bar, and I think we should confound cynics. The budgetary dysfunction has hurt us dramatically in Virginia. The combination of shutdown and sequester, hurting defense, hurting other key priorities, we feel it. I know you all feel it. In the spirit of compromise, I wanted to focus on 4 areas where I think we are closer together than we might think as an encouragement to finding compromise. First, and maybe the most controversial thing I'll say is this: we should acknowledge that our 2014 budget numbers really aren't that different. Now that sounds heretical. The Senate sets discretionary 2014 spending at $1.058 trillion. The House number is $967 billion, and that's a difference of $91 billion. That's a lot of dollars. But the federal budget is $3.6 trillion. The difference is about 2.5%. And I think you'd argue really it's smaller because the Republicans would argue the Senate number might be artificially high because we assume that there would be no continuation of sequester. And we assume that the House number is artificially low because you can't write appropriations bills to match the budget number. So I think the real difference between these two budgets in 2014 is about 1.5%. I can't believe that we're going to miss an opportunity to do something right for the nation, for our economy, because we can't close a difference in 2014 of 1.5%. So we're closer than we might think in 2014. Number 2, and this has been covered a lot, we should all agree that growing the economy should be the primary goal. The major test of a successful budget isn't ink on a page, and it's not even GDP to debt ratio. It's whether a government spending plan helps produce a growing economy where people in all regions and in all stages of life can have a path to economic success. That is what we tried to do in the Senate budget, and I look forward to more meetings with House conferees to talk about how the House budget accomplishes economic growth. That should be the goal. Third, we all recognize that sequester is a bad idea. Senator Warner talked about this. When it was passed, those who voted for the bill said, but don't worry, we'll never get to sequester because we'll make a deal. And those who voted against it largely said, I'm voting against it because a sequester is a bad idea. So everybody agreed at the time it was a bad idea. And now in the Senate, Senate Armed Services, bipartisan, has said we need to replace it. House Armed Services, bipartisan, has said we need to replace it. So if everybody thought it was a bad idea at the time, and everybody still thinks it's a bad idea, then there's no excuse for finding a better path forward. I hear some people talking in an almost impotent way, well, we just can't do anything about it. That's a cop-out. We should be able to fix it. Fourth, we all want to replace sequester with reductions in spending. The Senate's made a significant concession to the House on this. We do not propose increasing any tax rates. We don't. We think you're right. We need to make targeted cuts in spending in the discretionary side. We put in targeted cuts in spending on the mandatory side, but we believe strongly, as others have said, we have to be willing to look at the tax expenditures. The recognition that tax expenditures have to be reined in is bipartisan. President Obama, Chairman Ryan, Speaker Boehner, Martin Feldstein of the CEA chair under President Reagan, Mark Zandi at Moody's, all have said we should do this. Why would we reform Medicare, affecting millions of seniors, and not consider scaling back tax breaks to ExxonMobil? Ellen Greenspan said those tax breaks are tax entitlements, every bit as much as Medicare might be an entitlement. If you put it in the tax code, it's an entitlement. We ought to be willing to look at all the tax expenditures. And as Senator Kuhn said, if we just reduce the tax expenditures in the budget by 5 or 6%, it would create enough revenue coupled with an equivalent amount on the spending side that we could do significant work to replace sequester and draw our deficit down. All of my comments have basically been about one thing. I don't view finding compromises impossible. To the contrary, it's just doing our job. When I was governor, my houses, I had divided houses for 2 years and 2 Republican houses for 2, always passed very different budgets. But we found compromise that kept our government open and kept us with a AAA bond rating, and other states do exactly the same. So my last question is this. If bicameral state legislatures all over the United States can do this year in, year out, then why can't we? We haven't done a budget conference in true regular budget order in many years. Isn't this an embarrassment that we here should resolve to put behind us? Are state legislators more talented or more public-spirited than members of Congress? Let's surprise the cynics who say we can't do this. I know we can.
Thank you. Senator King.
Fellow citizens, we cannot escape history. We of this Congress and the administration will be remembered in spite of ourselves. Those are the words of Abraham Lincoln in a memorandum to Congress on December 1st, 1862, almost exactly 150 years ago. I want to emphasize, and I think the comments this morning have been wonderful, and put them together and you've got the essence of a solution. But I want to emphasize that this is a historic opportunity and responsibility. The other day after a hearing, I ran into an old history professor of mine I hadn't seen in 45 years, an American history professor, and I said, Professor Smith, if we ever had a moment in American history with this level of unfunctionality and chaos in our governmental system, he said, of course. And I was surprised he said that so quickly. I said, when was that? He said, the Articles of Confederation. The period before the Constitution, which provoked the framers to write the Constitution, was a period when government didn't work. And we're in a similar period, and that's why what we're doing here today is such an important and very heavy responsibility. The importance of doing something. The best thing we can do for the economy is show the American people that we can do it, that we can work together, that we can find a solution. 2/3 of the American economy is driven by consumer spending, and consumer spending is driven by confidence. And confidence is instilled by the government being at least modestly functional, which it hasn't been recently. It doesn't have to be a comprehensive solution, as Chairman Ryan and Chairman Murray both said, but it does need to be real. It does need to be significant. It at least needs to take us through September 30th, 2014. My second point is that the fiscal situation is serious. While presiding the other day, I know that we're not supposed to do our own work. We learned that yesterday from the parliamentarian, but I couldn't help doodling a bit about what would happen if interest rates went from 2% to 4%, which isn't at all unexpected in terms of our public debt. If that's the case, at a $17 trillion debt, 4% would be $680 billion a year, which exceeds both the defense budget and the intelligence budget combined. That is a dead hand that buys us nothing. No schools, no Head Start slots, no jet airplanes, no defense, no nothing. Interest on the debt exceeding the defense and intelligence budget combined. It crowds out everyone's priorities. Conservatives and liberals alike. It crowds out everyone's priorities. And in addition, as of course, it's an immoral burden on our children. But I do want to relay one additional thought on that front. When I was governor, one of the rituals was to go to New York every year and genuflect at the rating agencies, kiss their ring, and hope for a good bond rating for your state. I was doing that one year and talking about how prudent we were in Maine and how we didn't spend much. We had low per capita debt, and our debt was paid off in 10 years, and we were really careful with our expenditures. And one of the analysts stopped me and said, Governor, I want to remind you that not fixing your infrastructure is debt. It's debt just the same as debt that's on the books. And if you're stinting on maintaining your infrastructure, you are building up a debt for your children and grandchildren just as if you're borrowing the money. I think that's an important item to remember. The other thing is that we've seen all these charts today that have showed exploding federal expenditures. It's all health care expenditures. That's what's driving the debt. It's not Head Start, it's not Pell Grants, it's not the Department of Defense, it's not the CIA. It's health care expenditures in Medicare, Medicaid, federal pensions, veterans' health benefits. That's what's driving the deficit. That's what we really need to be talking about. And we're making a grave mistake if we cut those kinds of programs, whether it's on the defense side or the domestic side, because health care, like the interest on the debt, is going to crowd everything else out. So what do we have to do? We have to deal with this debt problem, which I've acknowledged is very important, but we have to do it in a way that doesn't compromise the economy. We have to do it in a way that is gradual and thoughtful and credible, but not all at once. We have a saying in Maine that the path out of the woods is usually as long as the path in. It's taken us about 15 or 20 years to get into this hole. We're not going to get out of it in the next 2 or 3 years. And so we have to have a credible plan that doesn't compromise the economy and the economic growth that everybody has talked about is the very best way to solve this problem. It will build confidence, it will lower deficits, and make the necessary investments. I'm not going to talk about tax expenditures, but they are expenditures. Both sides agree. In both budgets, we mine the tax expenditures. The only question is, what do we do with them? In the House budget, they're used to lower rates. In the Senate budget, they're used to lower deficits. I think there's a compromise to be found there. The Rubicon of getting new money from tax expenditures has been crossed by all parties. Let's just talk about how those tax expenditures are allocated. Finally, I'll go back to President Lincoln. December 1st, 1862, he talked about how to deal with change, how to deal with difficult problems, and how we have to clear our minds and think creatively. It's the best phrase I've ever encountered about how to deal with change, and here's what he said. The dogmas of the quiet past are inadequate to the stormy present. The occasion is piled high with difficulty, and therefore we must rise with the occasion. As our case is new, so we must think anew and act anew. We must disenthrall ourselves, and then we shall save our country. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I want to thank everybody for attending today's meeting. That was a quite closing. That was a good closing. I love that. I love that speech from Lincoln. I think we've had a good discussion. I think from both sides of the aisle, we see signs of common ground. That's a great start. Our next legislative session schedules don't overlap until November 13th. That is when we will reconvene at 10 a.m. With that, Senator Murray and I are going to consult on the next steps beyond that. And at this time, would you care to make a statement?
Mr. Chairman, I just want to thank all of our members for very thoughtful statements today. I think we have a good committee here and look forward to working with you as we set in place the process as we move forward. Again, thank you to everybody.
Great, thank you. This meeting stands adjourned.